Sal Khan is the founder and CEO of Khan Academy, a nonprofit with the mission of providing a free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere. He is also the founder of the Khan Lab School, a nonprofit laboratory school in Mountain View, California, where he teaches seminars in humanities and sciences. Sal's interest in education began when he was an undergraduate at MIT. He developed a math software for children with ADHD and tutored 4th and 7th grade public school students in Boston. Sal also taught test prep courses for the MCAT and was named Teacher of the Year by the National Test Prep Company. He holds 3 degrees from MIT and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Khan Academy offers free lessons in math, history, grammar, physics, biology, and many more subjects. And today, more than 61 million registered users access Khan Academy in dozens of languages in more than 190 countries. Please help me to welcome Sal Khan.
Thanks, Phyllis. Thank you. Thank you, Phyllis. Well, it's a huge honor to be here, and I'll just give a disclaimer. I have a weird cough, so I'll try to cover my microphone when it happens, and I might do elbow bumps with you guys instead of shake hands, because I don't want to be a vector for germs. So I always like to start conversations like this, just trying to understand the audience, especially how familiar you might be with Khan Academy. How many of you have used it with your children? Either your students or your own children. How many of you have used it yourself? And how many of you have kind of no idea what it is? Good, that's why we're here. Excellent, excellent. So for those of you who are familiar with Khan Academy, it's often associated with mathematics, it's often associated with videos, and both of those are aspects of it. But what we'll see is it's much more than that, and we really have a much bigger vision, and I hope that we collectively can work towards it. This is screenshots that some of you might have seen, either working on it with your students, working on it with yourself, where kids can do exercises, work at their own time and pace. There's a whole series of game mechanics. This is kind of the breadth of what's covered on Khan Academy today, over 30-something courses. And our vision here, as a not-for-profit with a mission of a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, is to cover all of the core subjects from pre-K all the way through the core of college. And that's either for a student somewhere on the planet who might not have access to resources or support or classes, or ideally, so it can be used in conjunction with incredible teachers so they can better differentiate for the students in their classrooms. This next screen, and I don't know if this is actually a really exciting project that has connections to Hawaii, where our mission has always been, hey, we want to reach students as early as possible. And as I had young children, I said, hey, it would be nice if I could, you see how important those early years are in their development. And then a few years ago, the Omidyar Foundation, Pam and Pierre Omidyar, who are based here in Honolulu, helped fund this work so that we're able to give high quality early learning through an app that has hundreds of books in it, hundreds of videos, and really allows students to go from the Head Start standards through the early Common Core standards. This is just a few more stats on it, and everything I talk about today, it's all not-for-profit. No one owns Khan Academy. It's all non-commercial, and it's all for free. So there's no catch to any of this. And as Phyllis had introduced a little bit earlier, these are the stats of where Khan Academy is today. And it's being used in some way, shape, or form in almost every planet on every country on the planet. I was about to say every planet in something else. But before I go into more depth on this and where we are going, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory of how all of this started, because I found myself here in a fairly serendipitous path. So if you rewind, it's almost 14 years ago, I had just been married. My original background was in technology, but I had gone to business school. I was now working as an analyst at an investment firm in Boston. And I had family visiting me from New Orleans for my wedding, and I was born and raised in New Orleans. And it just came out of conversation when I talked to my aunt, Nashrath auntie, that her daughter Nadia was having trouble in mathematics. And when Nadia came into the room, I asked her about it. She was 12 years old, 7th grader. And Nadia says, well, at the end of 6th grade, there was this placement exam at my school, and that placement exam had a lot of unit conversion on it, and I just can't understand unit conversion. And so I told Nadia, I was like, Nadia, I'm 100% sure you're capable of understanding unit conversion. How about when you go back to New Orleans, if you're up for it, I'm up for tutoring you. We'll get off on the phone. We can use instant messenger or whatever. Maybe there's some ways that we can see each other's writing. And Nadia agreed. And I remember this was August of 2004. Some of those first sessions were actually quite painful. She had just convinced herself that she's not capable of learning mathematics. She'd kind of checked out. And that first week was really just deprogramming some of that self-perception. Slowly but surely, she got open to it. Slowly but surely, about a week in, 2 weeks in, she got unit conversion. Then she got a little caught up with her class. Then she actually got a little ahead of her class. And at that point, I became what I call a tiger cousin. And so I called up her school. I'm sure y'all really appreciate calls like this. And I said, you know, I really think Nadia Rahman should be able to retake that placement exam from last year. They said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. And somewhat surprisingly, they let her retake that placement exam. And that same Nadia, who was at the end of 6th grade put into essentially a developmental or remedial math class, was then placed into an advanced math class. And so I was hooked. It was this little small intervention on my part. I was able to connect with a cousin who's 2,000 miles away, and a very important part of her life. And so I started then tutoring her younger brothers. And then the little firm I worked for, it was really myself and my boss. It was very small. My boss's wife became a professor at Stanford, so we moved the entire firm out to Northern California. But more relevant to this story is word gets around my family that free tutoring is going on. And so I soon find myself every day after work with about 10, 15 cousins, family, friends, all over the country, working with them on math and science and whatever they needed help on. And I immediately saw a pattern. My cousins and family friends and their kids, the reason why they were having trouble in math, it wasn't because they weren't bright, it wasn't because the subject matter was hard. And a lot of them even were A or B students, but it was because they had gaps in their knowledge. The reason why they're having trouble in 9th grade algebra is because there was a negative exponent in that equation. And they didn't really learn negative exponents well in 7th grade. Or there was a decimal, they had to divide by decimal, and they didn't really master that concept when they were in 5th grade. And I'm sure as teachers you see this every day. It's not unusual. In fact, in a lot of places I've observed 5th grade classrooms where a lot of the kids aren't really fluent with their multiplication tables, or algebra classrooms where kids really aren't fluent in their more advanced arithmetic. And so, as Phyllis introduced, you know, my background was in software. I was like, well, maybe there's a way for me to help fill in the gaps for my cousins. So I started writing software for them so they can get practice and immediate feedback. I put a little database behind it so I could keep track of what they were doing. And I kind of just opened it up for other folks. And I was showing this off at a dinner party. This was now November of 2006. You can imagine I'm a really fun dinner party guest. And all my friends knew I had this project with my family. And they say, well, what do you hope to do with it? I was like, no, this is just a family project. It's not a business. I'm just getting a lot of joy out of it. And the host of the dinner party, his name's Zuli Ramzan, have to give him full credit. He says, hey, Sal, this is all cool, but how are you actually scaling up your lessons? And I said, you know, Zuli, that's a good point. It's hard to do with even 10 or 15 cousins, family, friends, what I was originally doing with Nadia. You know, they're all in different places. They all are moving at different speeds. They all have different gaps in their knowledge. And I think, you know, I'm sure preaching to the choir, y'all are having to deal with this in classrooms of 30, 35 plus students, where all of these students have unique needs. And so Zuli says, well, I have an idea. Why don't you record some of your lessons as videos and upload them onto YouTube for your family? And I immediately said, no, Zuli, that's a horrible idea. YouTube is for cats playing piano. It is not for serious mathematics. But I went home that weekend. I got over the idea that it was not my idea. And I decided to give it a shot. And I just started making these little lessons. In fact, back then, YouTube wouldn't even let you upload something more than 10 minutes. So I had to be under 10 minutes. And it was just the things that my cousins were asking a lot about. Adding fractions with unlike denominators, exponents, dividing decimals. The same questions that I'm sure you guys get from the students every day. And I started telling my cousins, hey, why don't you watch this ahead of time? Send me your requests. I'll work out examples for you as well. And that way, when we get on the phone, we can dig that much deeper. And after about a month, I asked them for feedback, and they famously and somewhat backhandedly said that they liked me better on YouTube than in person. And at first, that's a little bit counterintuitive until you really put yourself in the shoes of the learner, and we've all been there. The first time that you're really trying to get your head around a complex topic, especially one that you might be a little intimidated by, no matter how patient your tutor, your teacher, your parent, your cousin might be, there's a little bit of pressure where you say, hey, why does A lead to B? And they'll say, oh, it's really simple. You know, A leads to C and C leads to D. And remember E from last year, and that's what causes F. And your reaction, it happens to us every day. It happens to me every day at work sometimes. You say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to waste their time. You don't want them to judge you. But then 5 hours later, maybe you're at home trying to figure that out by yourself. It's like, what did they say? Boy, I wish they could give me another explanation. But now they were able to do it at their own time and pace. There was no stigma attached to it. If you were a 9th grade student and you were a little bit foggy on some of your arithmetic, you didn't have to have any shame. If you were a calculus student and you're a little foggy on your algebra, no shame there, no stigma attached to it. But it's also important to point out what they weren't saying. They weren't saying that they didn't appreciate having me in their life. And if anything, it made our interactions with each other that much deeper. I was able to go even deeper into what was going on in their mind, on the social emotional side, what was going on in their life, and go into much deeper content with them. And so I took their feedback as positive, and I kept going. And I just happened to make it public on YouTube. And then within a few weeks, it started to become clear that people who were not my cousins were watching. And at first, I just saw the view count go up. And then the comments started coming in. A lot of those early comments were just simple thank yous. Even that I thought was a pretty big deal. I don't know how much time you spend on YouTube. Most of the comments are not thank you. They're a little edgier. But then they got intense. I started getting letters all over the country and actually the world. You know, this is the reason I was able to get an A in my algebra test. I'm retiring from the military, and while I was deployed in Iraq, I was able to use these resources to get up to speed, and now I feel confident that I can go to college and study engineering. I remember in those early days, I had a mother email me, and I brought my wife. I was like, this is incredible. And she said that both of her sons had a learning disability, and this content was the only way that they were able to keep up with their class. And because of that, her and her entire family were praying for me and my entire family every night. And you got to imagine, that was especially powerful for me. You got to remember what my day job, I was an analyst at a hedge fund. I was not used to people praying for me, at least in that way. And so I kept on going, and by about August 2009, I frankly had trouble focusing on my day job. There were about 50 or 100,000 people who were using the resources, both the practice stuff and the videos on a monthly basis. And I was getting letters. I would just try to get through my day to figure out, hey, what could I help create? How could I improve the software, et cetera, et cetera. And my wife saw that too, and we said, look, it feels like there's a real thing here. It feels like this could actually impact one day maybe millions of people. And so we sat down, we looked at our finances. Our first child had just been born. We had some money that we were saving up for a down payment on a house. But my wife and I agreed that, hey, maybe we could live off of it for a little bit. She was making a smaller salary. She was a resident at the time. And so I took the plunge. I set up Khan Academy as a not-for-profit, quit my day job, and said, surely the world will, maybe the universe will help make this thing happen, and we could reach millions and maybe one day billions of people. And I think anytime you do anything entrepreneurial, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, you have to start with that delusional optimism. And very quickly, reality hits. There were some foundations and philanthropists who were willing to meet, but by meeting 3 or meeting 4, I was getting a lot of, well, this isn't exactly what we fund, or we've already allocated our budget this year, or this isn't exactly in our strategy. And so you can imagine it was getting quite stressful. We were digging into our savings about $4,000 or $5,000 a month. I was getting a few $100s a month off of PayPal from random people donating. If it was any of you, thank you. But you can imagine, by about 10 months into that, I was questioning everything. I was waking up in the middle of the night, in cold sweats. I was, what have I done for my family? What have I done in my career? This was a mistake. And it was frankly one of those darker moments, and it was, I can laugh about it now, but it was frankly probably the most stressful time of my life. All of a sudden, a $10,000 donation came in. So I see who it is. Her name is Ann Doer, and she was actually in a neighboring town. We were in Mountain View, and she's in Palo Alto, both in kind of the Bay Area. And so I immediately email Ann, and I said, Dear Ann, thank you so much for your incredibly generous donation. This is the largest donation that Khan Academy has ever received. If we were a physical school, you would now have a building named after you. And Ann immediately writes back. She's like, well, I've been using your stuff with my daughters, and she actually was even using it herself. I had all these videos about the financial crisis and credit default swaps and et cetera, et cetera. And so Ann says, well, I see we're local. If you have time in the next few days, I'd love to meet up and talk about what you're doing. And so it was about, 3 or 4 days later, we're in downtown Palo Alto at an Indian buffet restaurant, and over lunch, Ann asks me, so what's your goal here? And I told her, when you fill out the paperwork to become a not-for-profit with the IRS, there's a part of the form that's mission, and they give you about a line and a half. And I filled out a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And Ann said, well, that's ambitious. How do you see yourself doing that? And I said, to be clear, it's a mission statement. I don't think I'm just going to be able to check it off this weekend and then move on to healthcare or something. But I do have some healthcare ideas. But I showed her, I used to walk around with this notebook of testimonials that I was showing to all of the potential philanthropists, literally from all over the world. I showed her how the usage of just the videos was growing exponentially, and I even had to shut down the usage of the software because it was breaking my $20 a month web hosting that I was using. And I said, the goal here isn't just videos, it isn't just the software, it's to create tools for teachers. I made kind of a primitive version for myself as I was the tutor of my cousins. We'd want to localize it into all of the languages of the world, cover all of the core subjects from early learning, math, English and language arts through the core of college. And Ann says, well, you've made a surprising amount of progress. I only have one question. How are you supporting yourself? And in as proud of a way as possible, I said, I'm not. And so she processes that, we pay the bill, we part ways, and about 15 minutes later, I'm driving into my driveway, and I get a text message from Ann. And it says, you really need to be supporting yourself, Sal. I've just wired you $100,000. So that was a good day, a little bit. And frankly, that was the beginning of a whole cascade of only what I can describe as surreal events. A month later, I was running a summer camp for middle school students. And the whole reason I was doing this is, a lot of times when people talk about online learning, they imagine somehow it's in competition with physical learning. They're imagining Amazon.com versus Barnes & Noble's or Netflix versus Blockbuster. But in learning, especially in K-12 learning, I think that's the 100% wrong idea. That it's not about them in competition, but how could they complement? One thing that I'm very clear with a lot of folks, I gave a talk at an ed school recently, and I just started off, and this is true for my own children, I think for anyone's children, if you could pick between an incredible teacher and incredible technology, I would pick the incredible teacher every time. But the lucky thing is we don't have to make that trade-off. The ideal is if we can create incredible technology in service of the incredible teacher. It's getting dark in here. This is getting cozy. But I'll get going. Thank you. Sorry, I'm sick. I'm not sure if it's me or the lights. I'm just a little, this is interesting. So I was running this summer camp for 7th graders, and the whole idea is if students could get micro tutorials at their own time and pace, if they could get practice and feedback that adapts to them at their own time and pace, then it frees up the classroom to go deeper. It frees up the classroom for Socratic dialogue, for peer-to-peer instruction, for teachers to do small, focused interventions while other kids are able to work at their own pace, or to do simulations where kids can really internalize an idea. And so I was in the middle of one of those simulations with these middle school students. I was having 6 of them play a game of Risk, while the other 20 traded securities based on the outcome of the game of Risk. It's a good game. And while that was happening, literally a trading floor of 7th graders, I start getting text messages from Anne, which you can imagine I now take very seriously. And there were 4 or 5 of them in a row, and they were kind of cryptic, but they essentially said, this is Anne writing, hi Sal, I'm at the Aspen Ideas Festival in Aspen, Colorado. I'm in the main pavilion. Walter Isaacson interviewing Bill Gates. Bill Gates' last 5 minutes talking about Khan Academy. So I didn't know what to make of what Anne was saying, so I immediately boot the nearest 7th grader off of a computer. And I start looking for some evidence of this thing. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, I was able to find a video, and I'll cross my fingers to see if it works. But this is what I saw. I could see it here. Oh.
My favorite vignette is that guy, Salman Khan. He was a hedge fund guy, making lots of money, and he quit to do these little web videos. And so we moved, I'd say about 160 IQ points from the hedge fund category into the teaching many people in the leverage rate category. So that was a good day. The day that his wife let him quit his job.
So you can imagine what was going on in my head. I mean, I was literally shaking. I was like, is this really happening? And I went home that night. I showed this to my wife. And I remember dinner that night very clearly. And I said, well, what's the protocol here? Do I call him? Just assuming he's not listed. And they left me in that limbo state for about 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, I'm in my walk-in closet, which at the time was Khan Academy Worldwide Headquarters. And I'm about to record a video, and then I see my cell phone rings. It's a Seattle number, so I answer it. Hello? Hi, this is Larry Cohen. I'm Bill Gates' chief of staff. You might have heard that Bill's a fan. Yeah, I heard that. And Larry says, well, if you're free over the next few weeks, we'd love to fly you up to Seattle and learn more about what you're doing and maybe ways we could work together. And I was looking at my calendar for the month, completely blank. I said, yeah, maybe next Wednesday, got to cut my nails, do some laundry. I think I can meet with Bill Gates. So we had that meeting, and it was eerily similar to that meeting with Anne. What would you do with more resources? I said, translate this into the language of the world, create tools for teachers so they can differentiate instruction, allow kids to fill in their gaps, work at their own time and pace, practice at any level that's appropriate for them. And at the same time, and they said, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. At the same time, some folks from Google reached out. Google's based in the same town where I lived. And they said, well, I don't know if you know, and they were actually surprised that I was just this one guy operating out of my house. They're like, a lot of us have been using your resources. And we've been thinking about, are there things we can fund to help enable learners and teachers around the planet? And everyone keeps telling us about this stuff. And so all of a sudden, it went from, before meeting Anne, me wondering whether this is going to even happen, whether I had kind of ruined my life and my family's life, to about 3 months later, beyond Anne and John Doerr, who gave that first support to allow me to have a living, the Gates Foundation and Google allowed us to get the resources to start getting office space, start building up a team, et cetera, et cetera. And to understand kind of our whole theory of change, what we want to really work on, we have to just take a lens at the world that most of us grew up in and most of us still operate in education. In traditional education, I go to the next. In a traditional academic model, we group students together around kindergarten by age, and then a middle school age and perceived ability, and then we move them together at a set pace. And what will typically happen, let's say we're in a 7th grade pre-algebra class, I, the teacher, will cover, let's say, introduction to exponents. And then maybe there's some in-class practice, maybe there's some homework, the next day you review it. And that goes on for a few days, and maybe after about a week or two, there's a quiz. And on that quiz or on that test, maybe you get a 70%, you get an 80%, you get a 95%. And even though that test has identified gaps, some of the students didn't know 30% of the material that happened to be on the test. Even the A student, what was the 5% she didn't know? It might have been a careless error, or it might have been something really important. Even though that happened, the whole class then has to move on to the next concept. And I know y'all live this every day. You know that a lot of your students might not even be ready for that next concept, but you're told, hey, I've got to cover these 60 standards in these 180 days. I've got to move on. And so the next concept is probably going to build on those gaps. It might now be negative exponents or fractional exponents or logarithms, somehow expecting that 70% student to understand that. And what's typically happening is kids are being promoted year after year through this process, and those gaps accumulate. And then all of a sudden, and a lot of you probably have experienced it, a lot of students hit a wall in algebra class. And it's not because algebra is difficult, it's not because they're not bright, it's because those little gaps, all of a sudden, you see an equation that has a decimal, a fractional exponent, you have to do some basic algebraic manipulation. If they have a gap in even one of those things, it's not going to make sense to them. Or in a calculus class, if you have little gaps in your algebra, it's not going to make sense. And this, this would have been very utopian for me to give this speech 50 years ago. There's really nothing you could do about it. You could get everyone a personal tutor, which would be amazing, but we know that that isn't economically pragmatic in a traditional school system. But it's at least worth taking a look at, because now we're at a time and age where maybe there are tools that we can start to give educators so they don't have to make that compromise as much. And to understand how strange it is on some level, imagine if we did other things in our life that way. Say, home building. So you bring the contractor in, and you say, we have 2 weeks to build the foundation, do what you can. So they do what they can, maybe it rains, maybe some of the supplies don't show up, and 2 weeks later the inspector comes and says, all right, that part's not quite up to code, the concrete's still wet over there, I'll give it a 80%. You say, great, that's a C, let's build the first floor. Same idea, we have 2 weeks, do what you can. And it could be the best contractor on the planet, but they just do what they can, they're time bound. Maybe some of the supplies don't show up again, after 2 weeks the inspector says, that's a 90%. You say, great, that's a B plus or an A minus, let's build the second floor. And then all of a sudden, while you're building that second floor, the whole structure collapses. And if your reaction to that is the reaction that many people have in education, they say, oh, maybe it was the contractor, or maybe we need more assessment with the inspectors. But when you look at it that way, you realize it had nothing to do with the contractor. It had nothing to do, it could have been the best contractor, which is analogous to the teacher, could be the best contractor on the planet. It could be a very reasonable assessment, which is analogous to the inspector, but the process was flawed. You're artificially constraining when and how long you have to do something, pretty much ensuring a variable outcome. You take the trouble of measuring that variable outcome, identifying those gaps, and then the contractor, even though they know that that's not sound practice, they're forced to build right on top of that, doing what they can. And then it's not a surprise that at some point things collapse. And so the ideal, and once again, this would have been utopian 50 years ago, but maybe we can think together how we could do it now. The ideal, instead of holding fixed when and how long you have to work on something with a variable outcome, A, B, C, D, F, what if we did it the other way? What if we hold fixed that every student should actually master the concepts? Every student should get to a 90% plus, ideally even 100%, get to that A level, and what's variable is when and how long they have to work on it. And they have supports from their peers, supports from their teachers, data, analytics, whatever, unlimited practice so they could really do that. But to appreciate just what is happening because of this process, despite the work that all of y'all, amazing work that y'all are doing day in and day out, and teachers around the country and the world are doing, we have this stat that is unfortunately a really tough statistic, which is at community college level, a majority of kids, 60 or 70%, are having to take remedial math. And remedial math or developmental math, it's a euphemism for 6th or 7th grade math. And this is not for lack of amazing work by their teachers, it's not for amazing work by their schools, it's because those kids, as they went through 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, they're going through the motions of algebra, they're going through the motions of geometry, but their gaps were so large that they're really not, it's really not sticking with them. And so our whole theory of change is, what if we can partner with others, partner with teachers, inform what they need, so that we don't have to make this compromise anymore? So that teachers can cater to the individual needs of every student so those gaps don't get developed. But if the gaps are already there, that they could help remediate those. And one notion, there's always been this debate around assessment. I had a good conversation with the head of the New York City Teachers Union. He had written an op-ed about assessment, and his whole point was, look, in theory, you want to measure where students are, But if you can't do anything with it, what's the point? In a lot of traditional assessments, you get the scores at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year, by the next year. It might be a different teacher. And then that teacher, even though they say, wow, 20% or 30% of my kids aren't at grade level yet, but I've got to cover the standards. What do I do? That assessment just took away from class time, and it's really just informing where everyone is, but it's not necessarily actionable. But we said, well, what if the assessments that people are already taking can actually inform tools for the teachers themselves, can actually inform practice for the students that the teachers can modify, so at least for part of their class time, not wholesale change, but part of their class time, they can allow those kids to work at their own time and pace. And so that's why it's exciting. These are actually screenshots. We called up the NEEA. Anyone here use the MAP growth assessment at your schools? Anyone here? A few folks are using it. So MAP growth assessment is one of those assessments. It's actually 20% of American children between grades 3 and 8 take this test. And their kind of claim to fame, NEEA, which offers it, they're not for profit, is that they measure growth versus just measuring whether a kid's at 5th grade or 6th grade. They can see how much growth they had in a year. And we called them up. We said, well, what if that could inform practice on Khan Academy? And they said this is exactly what all of their teachers have been telling them, all of their districts have been telling them. So we made this partnership where, hey, now when people take the test like that, they can actually inform personalized practice that, once again, it doesn't have to be 5 days a week, but even if kids are able to do it 20 or 30 minutes a week, that can make a big difference. And so, we're doing this with them, but in general, this idea of kids being able to practice at their own time and pace, it's available for everyone for free whenever they want, and it's completely non-commercial. These are just some screenshots of the types of tools that teachers are able to see, where they can see where every student is, how much are they progressing, et cetera, who could use the focused intervention on a specific topic, who could use a little bit of a nudge so that they get a little bit more motivated or engaged. And this is just a quote from Superintendent Jesus Jara at Las Vegas, and they are the district that we've been going deepest with on this partnership, where we're doing it with all of their 160,000 grade 3 through 8 students. And what he said is Clark County School District, that's Greater Las Vegas, has set out a 5-year plan to increase proficiency in reading, math, and science, and to significantly narrow opportunity gaps. We cannot meet our ambitious goals without providing our teachers with the best research-based resources they need in order to succeed. Now, when you start talking about online learning or blended learning or all of these things, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, this is a group that really likes to think about ed tech and the future, there's sometimes a negative stereotype that it's like, kind of this Vulcan or Borg reality of these kids on computers just focused on their own track, not necessarily being able to socialize and interact with each other. And, the one thing I like to make clear is the exact opposite of that if it's done well. When done well, kids are working with each other. They finally feel ownership over each other's work. The teachers are empowered with information so they can go do focused interventions. And the teachers who embrace it say, well, this is why I went into it. I'm finally able to have focused bonds with various kids and reach them where they need it the most. And to get a sense of what it feels like, I'll show you this next video, which is what you're seeing are some classrooms that they're trying to see whether they met their collective learning goals on Khan Academy in this challenge we do every back to school called LearnStorm.
Okay, you ready to check our progress?
So those are fun classrooms. The kid with the jersey on is especially entertaining. Now what, and the same idea, we're trying to reach as many students and teachers as we can and empower them with as many tools. About 5 years ago, the College Board reached out to us, the folks who administer the SAT and are responsible for things like AP exams, and they said, hey, there's been decades-old essentially inequity around test prep, where middle class and especially upper middle class kids are able to afford several thousands of dollars a year over just a summer to get test prep. What we like about Khan Academy is y'all aren't focused on how do you guess better or how do you just game something. You're very focused on how do you fill in your gaps, how do you actually learn it well. What if we were to partner together and make the world's best test prep that happens to be free? And not test prep that's just how do you game the SAT, but test prep on how do you actually fill in your gaps to be more college ready as measured by the SAT. And so we were super pumped about it. We agreed with that. And so about 3 years ago, we launched official SAT practice with the College Board. And this is a little news story that came out at the time of the launch.
Today is the last day students around the country will take the SAT in its current form. That is starting in March. A new test with lots of changes will be there for high schoolers. Here's NBC Dan Thompson.
I'm going to start my own business specializing in robotics.
I think I'd like to be a The first hurdle to achieving those dreams, the SAT. Today is the last day students will be offered the test in its current form. The new SAT promises to be quite different. All high school students like Amelia Teneo and Untitled Chapter now also have access to free online tutoring from the Khan Academy.
The software itself acts like a tutor. It shows you, hey, you should probably work on this.
Complete with points and badges.
And once you get to like the more advanced stuff, you get like really cool badges.
Sounds like a video game.
Let's express your answer.
Students have been practicing for months with sample tests meant to mirror the new SAT exam beginning in March. And have you done the mock SAT?
I have done well. By the time that I went to Mach 2, I boosted my score by 200.
Building confidence along the way to achieve new possibilities in the future. For today, Ann Thompson, NBC News, The Bronx.
So what's been exciting about that partnership is when we first did it, it was just around SAT, but then the College Board said, hey, there's this PSAT exam that I think 60 or 70% of all 10th and 11th graders take in America. What if that, like we talked about with the NAA MAP growth assessment, what if that could act as a diagnostic for personalized practice? And so now, for any of y'all who teach 10th or 11th graders, when you get your PSAT scores, there's a place where they can link it to Khan Academy if the students get permission, and then the software in Khan Academy will know what students' strengths and weaknesses are in math, reading, and writing, so that they can essentially do weak point trading between the PSAT and the SAT. And what's been very heartening for all of us is when you do something online, you want to make sure it's reaching everyone, because as we know, online isn't accessible to everyone. But we're seeing that the demographics of who's using it is essentially proportionate through the country. In fact, it's slightly higher proportions of kids from lower income families are using it, which is very heartening. And even more importantly, that every hour that they put into it is correlated with growth. And once again, it's less important that they're improving their SAT scores. That's obviously important for them. But it's even more important that they're just becoming more college ready as measured by the SAT. We're seeing that if kids even put in 6 hours over 6 months, so it's not a lot over 6 months, that they're getting 50% more growth than is expected between the PSAT and SAT. We're also seeing, as I said before, in classroom use cases, when kids are able to even do 30 minutes to 60 minutes a week. So once again, not all of their time in math, that they're able to grow 20 or 30% more than expected. And I was surprised when I first saw that data, but then when you really think about it, that they're finally able to address some of their gaps and learn at their level so that they can move ahead a little bit faster. This is just some more of that demographic data. So everything I've talked about so far is the world that most of us live in, the English-speaking world, North America, et cetera. A lot of you might be wondering, with the mission of free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, what about the rest of the planet? And all of these are pictures of Khan Academy being used other places. And full credit, it's other not-for-profits, volunteers, taking the work, sometimes taking it offline, bringing it into villages. I mean, all of these are incredible stories. If you look at the bottom, some of those kids in India, they're not even wearing shoes, but they're able to learn some more advanced topics. But probably the most exciting story was the one in the top right. I used to give talks like this and say, who knows, maybe one day we'll be used in Mongolia. And then I got a letter from Mongolia. And it was from that girl in the top right. Her name is Zaya. And she had a little YouTube testimonial. And I watch it, and she talks about how she really enjoys it, and she's learning a lot of math and science. And I immediately assumed that she's upper middle class or middle class because her English was quite good, and she clearly had access to the internet. And then I read the text of her email more closely. And it turns out that there was a group of volunteers from Cisco Systems who were using their vacation time to go to Mongolia and set up computer labs with internet in orphanages. And what you see in the top right, those are the orphan girls using Khan Academy, and Zaya was one of those orphans. And what's been even more incredible since then is that Zaya has graduated from high school, and she's become the top contributor to Khan Academy in the Mongolian language. So she's now helping to teach her fellow students. And this is just another one. Obviously there's something very unique about Zaya, and there's something very unique about who I'm going to tell you about right now. But it just tells you how many millions of people there are around the world who don't have access to incredible teachers like you, who are just marginalized in some way, shape, or form. This young woman, Sultana, about 8 years ago, she's in Afghanistan. The Taliban take over her town, forbid all the young girls from going to school, threaten her with physical violence directly, so she doesn't go to school. She's doing literally 10 hours of chores at home, cooking, cleaning, at age 12. And her brother-in-law sees that she's really curious, and so he gets her a computer with internet. And so she starts learning off of the computer. Initially she's teaching herself English off of the internet, which is a little scary, but it kind of worked for her. And then she got a hold of a Time magazine that she was just trying to learn English from, and they happened to have an article about Khan Academy on it. And she says, oh, this is what I need. And so every waking moment, she was staying up at night just saying, I need to learn more, I need to learn more. And she, for her, the big click was when she saw that she was learning more than her brothers who were in essentially Taliban-controlled schools. And so she just kept going. She got through algebra, trig, calculus, physics, chemistry, biology, decides that she wants to become a physics researcher in the United States. Young girl in a Taliban-controlled town. She meets someone in Iowa who tells her that, hey, if you take the SAT and do well, you might be able to come to college in the US. The SAT was not offered in Afghanistan, still is not offered in Afghanistan. So Sultana, at age 17, lies to her parents and smuggles herself across the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan, one of the most dangerous borders in the world, on a 30-hour journey just to take the SAT. So if any of you have like 16-year-olds who are complaining about going on a Saturday morning to tell them this story. She does shockingly well for someone who, frankly, never had formal schooling. And actually, that's when I find out about her. Her friend Emily, who's in Iowa, was able to get my contact, said, you have to hear this young woman's story. I was like, this is unbelievable. This is one of the reasons why Khan Academy started, that these people are out there. And I started emailing whoever I had in my contact list. And I have to say, I found out the hard way how hard it is for someone to come, especially if they don't have resources. A lot of universities in this country, you have to have 4 years of tuition in the bank before they even think about a student visa. But luckily, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times finds out about her and writes this op-ed, Meet Sultana, the Taliban's Worst Fear. And it was actually this story but based on this story, that she was actually able to get political asylum and come to the US. And the only reason why you haven't heard more about her is her family is still in that town, and she's afraid of becoming too public about her story for their safety. And just to know where she is today, she just finished a summer at Caltech doing research in quantum computing. So you can imagine, as hopefully valuable as differentiated instruction, mastery learning is for the worlds we're in, and there's a lot of need in Hawaii, in the United States, in the rest of the world it can get that much more desperate, where kids might not even have access to a school. And so that's why we have these translation projects, not just the videos, but the software, the teacher tools. There's actually 40 projects. 14,000 people around the world have volunteered their time to help make this happen. And just to get a sense of at least what the videos look like in other languages, I'll show you this next video.
Mercoledì 2, quartos de pizza.
Hypoténuse commune. Ok.
Si je stand 15.
أمريكا عدت ضغط خيلي بتخمس دقائق.
توجد قطعتين من ناتج النحاس والزنك.
P آن به توان 2 سهم‌تره.
كيف تنتشر أشعة السيوف التي تتفق مع ذلك؟
Muitas outras coisas importantes.
Isaiah from Mongolia, which is so interesting and funny, make more lessons.
I watch that when I get lazy. So these are just more pictures of kids around the planet using it, some in classrooms, some outside of classrooms. And when I see this personally, it's one thing to see the numbers of, how many millions, et cetera, and even that has surpassed, as my dreams when I was operating out of a closet. But what I tell everyone involved in Khan Academy now, and to be clear, I get disproportionate credit for it. It's much, much more than me now. We have over 200 full-time folks in our offices, a lot of current and ex-teachers, a lot of researchers, a lot of engineers, designers helping make this happen. We have had tens of thousands of teachers around the planet, and especially in the United States, helping us implement this, learning what works, learning what doesn't work. We've had 14,000 people around the world volunteer. There's hundreds of thousands of people, I'm guessing even many of y'all, who've helped donate to make this happen. We're philanthropically funded, not for profit. And what I tell all of y'all, and I hope, by the very fact of what you do, you are part of this mission. It's a much broader mission than obviously what Khan Academy by itself does. The public school system, the private school system, these are all about how do we give a world-class education for as many people as possible. And if you go back 100 years, that's a nice to have. It is worth appreciating what a big deal public education has done 200-300 years ago to make things where we are. But if you think about where we're going, every day you read newspaper stories about artificial intelligence and self-driving cars and what jobs may or may not be around in 20 or 30 years. It's no longer a nice to have that more kids are able to essentially get to the top of the pyramid. It's actually an imperative that we're able to get as many of our young people to the top of that kind of knowledge economy as possible so that they can participate. And for any of you who are skeptical as to whether most kids could one day become a tech entrepreneur or write the next great novel or become a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer and become part of that knowledge economy, I'll finish off with just a little thought experiment that I use also to even remind myself of what the opportunity is. If you were to go back 1,000 years to Western Europe, even then it was reasonably indicative of the world, even slightly more literate than the rest of the world, you would have seen about 15% of the population was literate, about 20% of men and about 10% of women. And I suspect that if you went to someone who was literate, say a member of the clergy, and you said, what percentage of the population do you think is even capable of reading? He might have said, well, today it's 15, 20%. Maybe with a great education system, it could be 40%, 50%. And if you pointed out the kid who's begging on the side of the street in the village, in this medieval village, you'd say, oh yeah, but that kid probably isn't capable of it, and there's actually no reason for him to even learn. But then you fast forward today, and we know that that would have been a wildly pessimistic prediction. That because of mass public education that got instrumented 200 years ago, and there's no coincidence that the countries that first implemented it, Japan, the United States, Germany, and the UK, were the first to have a broad middle class. But because of that massive innovation in the history of humanity, mass public education, we now know that that clergy member is wildly pessimistic, that pretty close to 100% of the population is capable of reading. But if I were to ask any of y'all, and even if frankly I would have asked myself 5 or 10 years ago, what percentage of the population do you think is capable of doing these kind of knowledge economy things? Becoming a teacher, doctor, lawyer, engineer, entrepreneur, writing a great novel, doing cancer research. You'd say, well, today it's less than 5%. Maybe with a great education system, it's 10 or 15%. But what if that's just because of the same blinders we have as that clergy member? Based on that same experience we have where we just saw a lot of times our peers, our students, sometimes ourselves, a gap here, a gap there, they keep accumulating over years, and all of a sudden you get to a class, and we've all gotten to that point at some point in our career, where things don't make sense anymore. And we tend to think, oh, it's maybe I'm not bright, or maybe this subject's too hard, but it's just those gaps kept accumulating. What if we could collectively create a world where we don't have to make that compromise? Where we can meet the needs of every student where they are? That just because one kid learns something a little bit slower doesn't mean that that kid couldn't be the next Albert Einstein. Slow does not equal dumb, as it oftentimes is implied in our popular culture. What if we're leaving the future sultana on the table because she just had a little bit of gaps in negative numbers? What if there's a kid down the street in Honolulu who could actually find the cure for breast cancer, but she thinks that she's not capable because she failed an algebra class because she didn't have fluency in her multiplication tables? What if we're allowed to fill in those gaps? And what if we're allowed to fill in their potential? Then I think we have a chance of this, frankly, being the most exciting time to live as a human being, where we could increase by an order of magnitude, by a factor of 10, the number of innovations, the progress we make as a society, solving big problems, whatever it might be, climate change, wars, economic problems. And big picture, it'll just be a very exciting time to live. And I know y'all are in this day in and day out, where we can take this thing called education and just make it that much more accessible and that much more addressing the needs of every student, and make it just like a human right, like clean drinking water or basic shelter. Thank you.